Hello everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to join the Voice of XR with Professor Mike Murdoch. I am a doctoral student at the Hololens School of Education and NSF AR/VR PhD fellow. This series of Voice of XR is made possible by Casey McMurray under a National Science Foundation as part of discurricular graduate training in science, technology, and application of augmented and virtual reality at the University of Rochester. I will introduce Professor Mike Murdoch. He has extensive professional research experience in both Europe and the United States, having received a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award and spending time conducting collaborative research in Ghent, Belgium, where also served as an associate professor and director of the Moselle Color Science Lab at the Rochester Institute of Technology. In addition to his professional research experience, Professor Mike Murdoch also led a research project on color appearance in augmented reality that is funded by National Science Foundation Career Award and conducts research on display and temporary dynamic LED lighting. Professor Mike Murdoch has a diverse educational background, including a bachelor degree in chemical engineering from Cornell University, a master's degree in computer science from MIT, and a PhD in human technology interaction from Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat. We will have a question and answer at the end. Lastly, this session is being recorded and will be available to you later on the Studio X website. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Mike. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the committee and who put this together and who invited me to speak today. I'm happy to present to you. I'm not far away from U of R, just a couple miles up the river at RIT. So maybe if I shout real loud, you can hear me from hear me there directly. But yeah, let me share the screen real quick. Yes, and I'm happy if anyone interrupts with questions. Zooming from my office is always a little bit lonely. It's hard to tell if there's anyone out there hearing anything, but feel free to pop in and ask a question. In fact, I find it harder to watch the chat. So if you do have a question, just pop your video up and then I will see you. And that's maybe easier for me to handle if you don't mind. Let me fix one thing real quick here. Cool. Good. So yeah, introduction covered a lot of this already. I've started with this picture, which is one of my creations via DALL-E, the AI image generator. I was visualizing the picture that I wanted to take, right? Take a new photo. I was thinking, okay, I could probably talk a grad student into putting on some glasses and standing in front of our spectrum projector and trying to get a good photo in the dark and whatever. And then I was at home. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just see what DALL-E can do. So this is the image of a color scientist using augmented reality. So there you go. Oh, come on, good. Yeah, so I want to start with some acknowledgements. On the left is a growing list of students, mostly PhD students, who've contributed to the work I'm going to talk about today. And that's why I'm here to train students and do good research in collaboration with them. And on the right, as mentioned, some funding sources from the NSF and from Fulbright and from both Meta and Microsoft over the years. So not to reiterate some of the things that were also said in the introduction, but at the top line there are sort of my educational background, and in the middle are my kind of career background, right? I do have this mix of industry and academic experience, which I think tends to kind of ground the things that I do. I'm usually thinking about both fundamental and application outcomes at the same time for most of the work that I do. And in fact, my education was pretty tied into the work that I did. I did study engineering at Cornell originally, but even while I was working there, while I was studying there, I was already starting to work for Kodak as a co-op in chemical engineering, working on film. So that picture there, actual slide film. I started working at Kodak full-time just at the end of film research, which was a fascinating imaging application to really work on. It was really like the peak of image quality for chemical imaging, which I'm really glad that I got to work on, even though I realized it was clearly a dead end and I had to shift gears. So I studied computer science and got into displays, and the dog picture there is on an OLED display, which were invented here in Rochester by Kodak and some U of R connections also, and have gone on to be things like the large screen TVs. The technology in LG TVs is the same as we developed at Kodak, so that's pretty cool. And then I moved to the Netherlands and worked for Philips Research, originally on displays. So this picture with the lines on it is a kind of a diagram of an autostereoscopic display that has a lenticular pattern on the screen that allows your left and right eyes to see different images, and then you could present stereo without needing glasses or anything else on the face of the viewer. So I kind of shifted into 3D things there. And then the final image on the right is part of a project that I worked on with 3D graphics simulations of lighting in architectural environments, right? So Philips at the time was both a display and a lighting company, and also like medical imaging, but I didn't really work on that part. But I got into 3D graphics and was creating these kind of simulations to show customers, but also researchers, and to do perceptual studies, what lighting could look like or would look like in a real space in an accurate way. And while I was there in the Netherlands, also did my PhD at the Technical University in Eindhoven, as a side project. So got that done there too. I'm talking to you today from the Munsell Color Science Laboratory here at RIT. This is a recent picture of the group. Unfortunately, I'm not in it because I was on sabbatical in Belgium when they took it. But just to tell you, this is what we look like and where we are. We run a graduate program, master's and PhD in color science. So there is no undergraduate component, but we're closely connected to undergraduate majors like imaging science and photo science and motion picture science. We also bring in graduates of programs in a real wide variety of backgrounds, like chemistry and computer science and physics, and even art, to come here and study color science, because color is a really multidisciplinary topic, and we really value all those different perspectives. The kind of courses that we teach here range from colorimetry and vision, but also things, fairly specialized things like color physics and psychophysics, measuring sensation based on stimulation, especially for vision and color. And then the research topics that we cover here, it's not just me, right? There's a broad faculty of people here working on everything from displays and printing, 3D printing, through color appearance modeling, really trying to make models of how vision works. Also computer graphics, AR, VR, and LED lighting. And the last two are my main research focus topics, AR, VR, and LED lighting. So today I will not talk about lighting, but I will talk about the AR part of this. Speaking of today, this is the quick agenda here. I want to talk briefly about color perception, because many people I talk to in a forum like this, a wide audience or outside of the color science world, don't know much what color science is. So it's worth kind of explaining what I have in mind with that. And then we'll talk about color in displays in general, but also for XR displays, right? AR and VR displays. And then I'll get into the research that I've been doing on color appearance in augmented reality. So we'll start here. This is kind of color science 101, the triangle that describes the process of color perception, right? And this is a process or an experience, because color can't really exist without all three of these components, right? Typically, you have some sort of a light source shining on an object. The object has some reflective characteristics that means some of the light gets reflected into your eyes, and your eyes and your brain together interpret what's coming into those eyes and figure out what color is the thing that you're looking at. And also there's an arrow here showing a connection between the light and the human, and that's, of course, there's light shining there, but part of that is an understanding, right? You're always interpreting what kind of lighting environment you are in, and trying to figure out what you can attribute to object color versus lighting color, what's a surface color versus light and shadow, These kind of things are always, unconsciously being processed by your visual system as you understand what's around you. And most people like to attribute color to objects, right? You have a blue thing or a red thing, but if you have a red apple and you shine blue light on it, it's going to appear black, right? And so I challenge that from the start, that objects have, propensity for color, but of course that is changeable by the lighting that you give it, but is also changeable by the observer that you look at it with, right? It's hard to put yourself in someone else's eyes, but different people have different sensitivities, both in terms of like real vision deficiencies, but also just within what you would call normal color vision. There's a fair bit of variation in how people perceive things. And of course, if you look at objects with a camera or some other sensor instead of the human eyes, you're going to get different color matches and different experiences. So another way to look at color, we usually think about color as having 3 dimensions. The circle on the left is illustrating hue. These are the color names you always think about. That's fairly easy and intuitive. On the right, this sort of grid pattern, top to bottom, is the dimension of value or luminance or brightness or intensity, perhaps. Different words kind of are similar synonyms. And on the x-axis is chroma, from kind of achromatic gray out to a highly saturated or highly chromatic color. And you can see that those chroma scales can exist at any value level, and of course at any hue, right? I'm just showing you the yellow hue, but you can imagine that this works for all the hues in the color solid. And that's another way to think about it, is a 3-dimensional space in sort of a cylindrical coordinate system. This is part of the Munsell color system, named or created by Albert Munsell, for whom our color lab is named, the Munsell Color Science Lab. But this is a very kind of intuitive way to put a number on colors, right? So there's numbers here on the value scale. The color, the hue circle kind of has names, and then the distance from the core is an indicator of chroma. So you can imagine that any color you find out in the world, you can locate it in this space and put a number on it, a coordinate in this Munsell color system, and then communicate that to someone, right? That's the real value here. You can say, I want this specific red as a t-shirt, and then the t-shirt factory can reproduce that. And of course, it's not always Munsell, right? There's a lot of other ways to specify colors, but this is a very nice intuitive one that we use a lot here, and it's very valuable for teaching. So another thing about color, of course, is that it depends on context, right? It's one thing to specify the coordinates of a given orange, but maybe you see this, if I surround the orange by red or by yellow, it seems to change the appearance of the orange, right? So this is one of these visual tasks where you look at it, and I'm going to promise you that the pixels in the 2 orange circles are the same, but probably you perceive them as slightly different in color, right? You probably agree they're both orange, but if you look closely, one may be lighter than the other or darker than the other, and they might be slightly different in hue. And that's because the surrounding affects our perception of it. And this is also possible without color, kind of in an achromatic sense. In fact, this one might be even stronger, that the difference, the appearance difference between the 2 gray circles is probably stronger than you saw with the 2 different oranges. So there's always context. So even putting a number on the color, on the name of the color in the circle, isn't enough perhaps to describe the appearance of color. And this demo can get a little more interesting here. This is from Edward Adelson, who's done a lot of cool visual examples like this. But I ask you to look at patch A and patch B here on this checkerboard, and probably you look at this and you understand that there's a shadow falling on B, right, from this cylinder, and you realize that the A is one of the dark patches and B is one of the light patches, and so they're obviously very different in sort of lightness. But of course, the trick here is that they are the same shade of gray in this diagram because of the way that shadow is cast. And this is a synthetic example to make that really obvious to you. But it's just to get back, just to remind you that we're always interpreting context. It's not just what's immediately around it. It's our understanding of where the light is coming from and where's the light and shadow, attributing the relatively low luminance of this one to the shadow, not because of the object color. Even though this is just synthetic computer graphics being looked at on a screen, different than you might imagine the real setup sitting in front of you on a table, but our visual system is able to interpret it similarly. So I mentioned colorimetry. Colorimetry, really, you can tell from the word, is about measuring color. And one way to think about that, we do a lot with, with standard color targets or color checkers like this. A light bounced off of any of these patches is measurable. We can describe that in coordinates that are meaningful for human vision. And then we can add to that the idea of color appearance modeling. So that same orange patch with a white surround versus a black surround, again, they probably look slightly different to you, both orange, but slightly different. And so we have the idea of color appearance modeling. And to not get into the details of this, the CAM, the color appearance model, is sort of a set of calculations that takes in information about the stimulus, right? The spectral information or the color coordinates of the color you're interested in, some information about the surroundings of it, and some more information about the observer's state of adaptation, right? So if you are, under yellow light, you're going to be adapted to that and perceive things differently than if you are adapted to bluish light. Same with light versus dark. That state of adaptation really affects how you perceive things. So the idea is that those are enough for the calculation to describe and really put a number on characteristics like brightness and colorfulness and hue to describe that. So you could say, what is the appearance of this object in different viewing environments? Or the other way would be to say, what object do I have to, what color do I need to make this display so that it appears the same as it would in a different viewing environment, different luminance, different something or other. So these kind of details are used in color management and also in the production of cinema movies and things, and they're fairly well defined. But then new technology comes along and you get weird stuff like this happening. And this is one of my travel photos from my trip to Belgium this fall. This is a real example of an augmented reality application in the crypt or the basement of this famous cathedral in the city of Ghent in Belgium. And what you're looking at is a photo that I took by holding my phone up to the eyepiece of a Microsoft HoloLens augmented reality display. And so the first thing I should tell you is that taking a photo through that is really not a great idea. It's very hard to do well. And so the quality of the visual here is poorer than it was visually with my own eyes looking through it. So let me give that excuse for the system, but it illustrates what I want to show here. So what you're looking at, let me try to explain this sort of central region with the magnifying glasses and the reddish kind of bias to it is what's being produced by the augmented reality display, right? And that's a transparent display through which you can see the actual background of the crypt. So this stone and the bricks and the windows are the real world out there behind the transparent view that you see through the augmented reality display. And the reason I'm showing you this is, for one, to talk about this cool old painting, which is, the most famous Renaissance painting in all of Belgium, painted in 1432 and stolen by Napoleon and stolen later by the Nazis and returned somehow safely to this church. This is just the AR view of it as they explain all the details of it before you go up to look at the real thing upstairs in the main church. But the reason I want to show you this here is because it clearly illustrates the kinds of distortions that you get in an augmented reality display like this, right? Even though I said the camera is not doing a great job of illustrating this, you do get some weird stuff like color non-uniformities, but more importantly, you get things like these windows visible through the transparent display. Versus over here where the background is quite dark, the image is relatively undistorted, but here where this window is behind the AR display, you really can't see what the AR is doing because it's kind of washed out by the window coming through. So this kind of intrigued me, and I got into this idea of color appearance modeling for AR systems because there's more happening, and I realized that there's more happening than just these three things here. There's something about transparency. There's something about layers that is not accounted for with this sort of a color appearance model. So let's repeat this slide and also acknowledge that in the natural world, yes, often it's a light bouncing off an object, but in our digital world, often it's light produced by an object, right? Or a display in this case. We spend a lot of time staring at displays like you're doing right now. And those could be big LCD displays, they could be projectors, or of course they could be, head-mounted displays, headsets, VR, AR systems like this, bringing the light right into your eye. And Perhaps you've seen a plot like this before. These are the spectral sensitivity of the 3 cone types in our eyes. So this is the x-axis is wavelength from blue to red, so from higher energy to lower energy. And these curves are the relative sensitivities to each of those wavelengths from the 3 cone types that we have, typically called long, medium, and short wavelength sensitive cones. And you see that they're fairly broadband in their sensitivity, and they overlap quite a bit. But they're essentially, there are 3 types, right? So there's essentially like a 3-channel recording system in our eye. And we take advantage of that in displays through additive color using usually 3 primaries. I did mention OLED displays before, which often use a 4th primary. It tends to be a white, but it could be another color. So you can do more than 3 primaries. And your primaries don't have to be red, green, and blue, but red, green, and blue are a very useful primary set for displays because they allow you to create a lot of different colors. So this diagram maybe is familiar to you from, who knows, science museums or basic textbooks or other things, but this concept of adding together red, green, and blue to make white, or any pairs of those to make what we call secondary colors, is pretty critical to displays and takes advantage of this trichromatic or 3-channel nature of our visual system. And adding these up to white is, cool, but more importantly, we can mix and match these, and we can actually do math with the primaries, right? So you have full power red, green, and blue here, but you can scale those down, right? 80% of red looks kind of like this, almost the same. 60% of green is, noticeably dimmer green. 20% of this blue is a dimmer blue. If you add those together, you don't get white, you get something that's biased, right? Because you've taken away some of the blue and green, especially energy. So you get this sort of beige color. And you can do the same thing with this diagram that I showed before, where the overlap here is not white because they're balanced differently. It's some other color. So you can generalize this and think, well, any linear combination of these 3 primaries is possible. And that's how we get, millions or billions of colors out of these displays, and trick our eyes with only 3 colors to make it look like a lot of colors. Now, this overlapping circle diagram is illustrative, but in fact, most displays do it something like this, where they're laid out spatially. They don't actually blend into a common thing, but they're small enough and far enough away from our eyes that we can't resolve the differences, and we sort of do the blending with the optical imperfections in our eyes. So displays kind of all behave the same. That's a very general thing to say because there's a lot of different kinds of displays, but they all do kind of create additive color in a similar way like that. So if I jump to VR displays, here's kind of a silly, simple example here, but to illustrate this point, the display itself that's inside the box that you put in front of your face is probably the same kind of display that's much like your laptop or your phone that you're looking at now, which could be an LCD, meaning a liquid crystal display, or an OLED, an organic light emitting diode display. Kind of the same as any other display in terms of its color performance, but then there's some optics added to it, right? This is a very simple setup here, but most AR and VR displays have to be quite cost conscious, which means these lenses tend to be relatively cheap and simple, and therefore introduce some distortions, which are not awesome, but we live with them, right? Like chromatic aberration and geometric distortion, and also resolution, differences across the visual field and other things. Sometimes when you put on a VR headset, you see the pixels that I said that you shouldn't see, just because of the magnification that you get with this. But my interest is mostly on augmented reality displays. So these are some examples of that. And these interest me because they're transparent, right? So kind of the problem that I was describing in the church basement image, you can see the source of that here, right? Here's 3 examples from different points in history. That's me in wearing the Microsoft HoloLens in the center there. This one on the left is from the 1960s, one of the earliest examples of this, with CRT tubes projecting into kind of a prism into someone's eyes. This is an early version of the original Meta before Facebook took the name. There was a different company called Meta at the time that created an AR glasses set. But the point of this is to show you that in all 3 cases, you can see the viewer's eyes from outside, which means that the viewer looking through this can see the outside world from through it. And that's where this transparency is there. And that's really valuable for these kind of displays because it allows you to still see the real world and, put things virtually put things into the real world that appear to be mixed in with the real world. So I made these images to try to illustrate the visual differences that you can see between these kinds of systems. And the differences here are a little subtle, so let me describe them. The image on the left is, I'm calling it VR. Everything in this image is synthetic, right? The Stanford bunny, this book and the orchid and whatever else. So the Stanford bunny I just found, but the rest of it I just built in 3D, and it's just a 3D model, right? Illuminated virtually and the image made with a virtual camera. The one in the middle is illustrating one kind of AR, VST, video see-through AR, where now the background is a photograph. So in my house with this table and these books and this actual orchid, photographed the background, and then in image processing added the same rendering of the Stanford bunny on top of it, right? Occluding the background with an alpha matte. If you used Photoshop and cut out a background and put something over the top, or as you see me here in Zoom, myself cut out and installed on a fake background, right? That's exactly the same process here. This is possible with a different kind of AR, VR setup. Some of the newer headsets have forward-facing cameras that could give a live view of the real world, and then in video processing overlay synthetic objects like this bunny on the thing. So this is one way to do AR. And this on the right is the other way, the one I was just describing with the transparent display, where the real world is still visible. I made it slightly darker because the plastic or glass of those tends to be sort of like sunglasses. And then the bunny is presented on a transparent display. So it looks bright and crisp, but the background can be seen through it, right? So you can see the bunny is distorted by the lighter or darker background coming through it a little bit. So if you look at the three of these, you might think to yourself, well, VR is nice if you have synthetic everything. But this one looks pretty good because everything is perfect, right? And there's no distortion from the background. But there's some other reasons why this system may not be optimal, right? Like looking through live cameras can cause some lag, which might lead to simulator sickness and other problems. But some people believe that this is the way of the future for AR because of these kind of transparency problems with optical see-through AR. I don't really know, but so far I've been looking into the perceptual attributes of this system, and we'll see what happens in the future, which one of these dominates or whether they both coexist. I don't know. Right. So back to the crypt of the church. Here's Napoleon's soldiers stealing the painting and taking it away at some point. This is indicative of the kind of optical distortions you get in the system. Here are some of the different ways, the different optical systems that are used to get to create the transparent display and get the photons into your eyes, right? Some of them are fairly simple, like with a half mirror, just reflecting something into your eye. Some have fancy amorphic or optics, custom shaped optics. Some of them have a waveguide, which is a pretty fancy way of kind of hiding the light into a thin strip of plastic and then popping it out at the other end with a diffractive grating. All of these are possible. They're all kind of complicated, and when you try to make them cheap and lightweight and whatever else, they all end up with a few different kinds of artifacts. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people working on making those better, and I'm not one of those people, but I look forward to better optics in the future. But at the moment, it's hard to use these for the kind of research that I do, because it's hard to very accurately calibrate their color output and have uniformity and other things that I'm interested in. So to be honest, I tend to leave these real AR systems on the shelf and use a much sort of simpler custom setup like this to do AR experiments. So this is a diagram and a photo of the same setup. And the idea is, from the observer's perspective, they can see through a diagonal beam splitter into a viewing booth, which has a light source and whatever object you put in there, right? So some rays of light come through the beam splitter to the viewer. And then there's a display facing kind of upward that reflects off of this beam splitter into their eye. So what they see is the optical mix of these two layers. And this is what it looks like from the front. In real use, we cover up most of this, so you're only looking through this sort of hole here. But for the sake of this photo, you can see that this display is showing mostly black, but also these two squares. And when the squares bounce off the beam splitter, it looks like they are overlaid on these other color patches, which are like printed on a kind of easel thing behind the beam splitter itself. So this setup is very easy to control. It's a normal display. It also means I have full control over the light source, the objects, whatever's in the background, which sometimes also is a different display, just to allow more flexibility, and the lower display there. So everything is easy to control. This sort of system of looking through a beam splitter is super simple and also kind of very common. And I've shown pictures of shop fronts in a lot of presentations, which gives me a little bit of a chuckle, but this is something that you've seen on the street, right? Maybe not this particular town in Belgium, but something like this you've passed by many times, right? Where you can see through a sheet of glass into, in this case, a furniture store with all these cool couches and things, but also you see the reflections of things out on the street. And these end up optically mixed, right? It looks like they're all sort of merged together in a photograph like this. In real life, as you move, the parallax between those, they move relative to one another. So that gives you very clear cues that they're not in the same place. But also cognitively, it's very easy for you to understand what's indoors and outdoors here. And you have no trouble separating these layers and perceiving what's going on. But this optical blending and beam splitter thing is not a new idea. This has been used from the 19th century. This illusion called Pepper's Ghost is a cool example where in a theater production, the audience is looking through a beam splitter at an actor on the stage, and that actor appears to be interacting with a ghost, and that ghost is transparent and can actually pass through the actor. And the way they did that was by having the ghost actor downstairs in this sort of secret compartment lit with a bright spotlight that reflects off of this beam splitter, so the audience sees them in the reflection. And guess what? If you turn off the spotlight, the ghost disappears and vanishes, right? And it's gone. So this was in the era of literal smoke and mirrors when they would do illusions like this. But this is a really simple effect. It's exactly what I'm doing in this setup here. Also, you may have seen it yourself in places like the Haunted Mansion in Disney World, if you've been there. So the research that I've been doing with that box kind of follows two related but different questions, right? And I'm trying to illustrate this maybe in cube world here. Case A here, you see the virtual square is sort of, or cube is sort of floating in front of the background. That's the way most people think of AR, where you want to put a virtual bunny on your table, or you want to put a virtual person at the table with you in a conference or something like that. Case B is a little bit different, where the cube is sort of aligned with a background cube. And maybe you haven't thought about this version, but you could imagine that would happen. Say you want to visualize what you would look like with a different shirt on the actual shirt you're wearing, or you want to visualize what it would look like with different paint or art on your wall or something like that. So you have to kind of align the foreground, the AR foreground, with the real world background and make things work there. But in both cases, you end up with a situation where the background bleeds through. You can create the concept of perceptual scission. This is a cool word, meaning like perceptually you can separate the layers like I described in the shop window. And you might end up visually discounting one layer or the other. And we've shown in research that we can discount either the real world background or the virtual foreground, depending on what you're asking observers to do. So that's fun. So let me give you a couple examples of that. Here, looking at kind of case A, the object in front of the background, which is kind of what was happening in the church crypt here. In our experiments, again, a complicated scene like this is very hard to infer much about color perception. So we tend to simplify things a lot. And this is one example of showing pairs of the small squares are AR transparent, and the larger squares are printed real world target in the background. And maybe you can tell, it's clearer here perhaps, these two kind of faintly purple AR patches were the same color on the display itself, but when the background comes through them, you can see perhaps this one is lighter and not the same hue as this one, because just the background coming through it. So in a very simple experiment, we asked people to change this one, right? Adjust the hue and chroma and value of that to match visually this one. And we found that they could do that. And we did something similar with not just flat patches, but also cubes and other more complicated figures. Again, you can see that this one is kind of paler and lower contrast because the gray is behind it compared to this one. Ask people to adjust this one to match, that kind of thing. And the short story from these kind of experiments was that people were able to make matches. When you give people 3 dimensions of control, you always get a fairly noisy result because it's a little bit tricky to dial in all 3 of those together. And so we saw a fair bit of variation between people, but we also saw that people seem to be discounting the background, meaning you can tell that this gray is coming through it, and somehow visually, cognitively, you're able to ignore that to some extent. So you adjust this one to match, but it's not a physical match, it's a perceptual match, and it's measurably different from the physical match. And that difference is what we're attributing to this discounting, which results from the scission of the 2 layers. The other case I mentioned was this sort of background focus where you're overlaying something on it. And I made a picture here of this. Here on the left is a photograph of an actual 3D cube made of styrofoam painted dark gray. And in the middle is the same cube, except I've put an AR overlay on it that makes it look like it's either illuminated brightly from the side, or perhaps it's painted 2 shades of gray, and you can tell. And so this is a way to sort of manipulate the appearance of real world objects with AR. And this picture, something went wrong with that picture, so ignore that. So we did an experiment using this setup where here there are 2 physical real world cubes painted different shades of gray. And we asked observers to adjust an overlay on one of them to match, right? So you're adding some light with AR to this cube to make it brighter, to make the cube match here. And you might say, well, you've lowered the contrast here and the shadows and things don't match. And in this case, you're right. So we said, okay, just match the top. So the brightness of the top faces here in this case. And the observers were able to adjust just the luminance of this. So we went from a 3-dimensional matching task to just a 1-dimensional luminance only task, just to simplify things for the observer and to really focus on this level of detail. And you can see that this overlay is not awesome, right? There's this big overlap where the overlay is bigger than the cube. So in fact, we were looking at quite a variety of overlays. This is the one you're just looking at, but there's one that's even bigger and square. The one that gets a little closer, this one is really tightly fit, like perfectly aligned to the cube. And this one is also perfectly aligned, but also maintains the luminance ratios between these. And so there's sort of a gradient here from really precise physical like up to like very obviously fake and weird. And then this is separate. But what we found from these were that if you give them this cue, this sort of obviousness that you're doing this overlay, people discount the AR quite a lot, meaning they add more light than they should have physically to make this match. Whereas if you make it more physically plausible like this, they have a harder time separating the layers and they can't really discount anything. And so the perceptual match here is much closer to a physical match. So this kind of confirmed this scissioning hypothesis, and it led us to kind of a simple model combining those 2 kinds of experiments where I'm using XYZ here, which is a color specification kind of related to vision that it's not worth getting into too much detail about. But the point is that what you actually see, what's actually reaching your eye, is the sum of whatever's in the foreground and whatever's in the background, right? And physics says it's just 1-to-1, right? You have the background, you have the foreground, you add them together, and that's what you get. But it seems like perceptually, you're weighting those in some way. So this is almost the same equation, except there's this alpha weight and this beta weight in there. And of course, physics would say that those should both be 1, but perceptually, this discounting means one of them is going to be less than 1 and one will be 1 or a little more than that. And then the values of these really depends on what we're asking people to do. And for the color matching experiment that I mentioned earlier, people put more weight on the foreground. And for that brightness matching task where people were looking at the cubes behind in the background, they put more weight on the background and less on the foreground. So this is cool. But it turns out that it's really hard to predict upfront what these alphas and betas should be for a given task. So to show you a picture of another experiment.
Question?
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you say background in this case, you're talking about what's directly behind the virtual object, right? Or the virtual display, like not the surrounding.
Yeah, I mean the object, yes, right. So in this case, it's the cube is the background, and the AR, whatever hexagon here, is the foreground. Yeah.
Right. So in the foreground experiment, or so in the color matching experiments, how do you separate what is actually a mixing of colors versus the, like you said in the beginning, how the surrounding can affect your, or does that matter, or is that automatically taken into account? Everything works together, kind of thing.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm actually going to kind of get to that in a second. But you are quite right that you interpret this color differently because of the surrounding, for the same reason I said at the beginning, which is always the case, and not something specific to the augmented reality. So the AR adds the transparency to that changes your interpretation. But good question, and let me get a couple slides further, and maybe it'll be clearer what we're doing with that.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, so this is also related to that question. So this is another experiment now to try to get more information about how this alpha beta weighting works. And here we're trying to really get this correspondence between what people see in AR and how they would interpret that as a real object. So I've shown you sort of the components of this composite image here. The AR is not showing much at all. It's mostly black with a red patch, some instructions, and a couple like indicators to tell you where you are in the interface. The real background is this lower photograph, where this is one page from the Munsell Book of Color. I showed you what the yellow page looked like earlier, but this is kind of one of the red hues. And then this is kind of an easel with a medium gray and a dark gray or almost black patch there. And so what it looks like in composite is the AR patch kind of in front of either this black background or this light gray background. And the task for the observer was to say, okay, indicate where on this page is the best match to that color that you see there, right? So for me right now, maybe it's this one. And as you might imagine, if you put that red patch up here, you get more gray light coming through it. You're also changing the surrounding, as the question was just asking, but the more gray light coming through it makes it look lighter and less saturated, and people were choosing different colors for that. So the quick overview of the results of this experiment, I've kind of characterized with adjectives, which kind of describes it well, I think. So first thing to say is the bottom left one here is the easy category. So if you give somebody just the colored patch on a black background, the black isn't doing much, right? It doesn't add much light to it, so there's not much to choose here. So when I say easy, I mean that everyone kind of agreed and didn't take much time to do it. Because you always have to ask a bunch of observers to do these tasks and do some statistical analysis. In this experiment, we also did some variations with a surround. So here, this light gray or white surround is part of the transparent AR. So it's really like the figure in the foreground is both the white and the red together. And just putting that white surround around it, for one thing, makes it look more like this page, right, which also has white surrounds, but it also kind of anchors people in a way that makes it even easier, so really easy. And by that, I mean like the distribution among people was even tighter than it was in the easy case, and went quicker than that. The upper row here is what happens when you put it on the light gray, which is basically confusing, or at best less confusing. And I will just say that for this one, if you put this patch on the light gray and look at it, you could think to yourself, well, that's either a nice saturated red, except it's transparent because I see the gray coming through it, or maybe it's an opaque red patch that's actually kind of a pale pink, right? And both of those interpretations make sense given the sort of this much visual information. And so we did see kind of a bimodal answer here, or more of a spread, not so bimodal. But also over the course of the experiment, like your understanding of what's going on here also changes and improves. So this much visual information isn't enough to resolve that difference, but sort of as you go through the experiment, you get more visual information and you understand what's happening. And so things get easier and less confusing later on. But again, you're quite right that this is connected to this simultaneous contrast situation that we've had before. And so putting that into the model explicitly has been part of the work we're doing just recently. So that's a good point there. The idea that you could just subtract or discount part of the foreground or background in addition to accounting for this simultaneous contrast difference that you see when the surrounding of the figure is different. So a related figure to this is this one, which sometimes called induction or assimilation. It's a different kind of induction that's often called assimilation. Now here, I'm going to go back to the other one. There are 3 shades of gray here, right? These 2 circles are the same shade of middle gray, and then there's a lighter and a darker gray. And if all I do is shuffle those pixels around, so now instead of big boxes of dark and light, now you've got these interspersed stripes. The 2 gray circles, I think to your eye, probably look much different from one another, right? I assure you that the pixels in the round part of the figure here are the same again, but the dark lines across them makes the whole circle look darker versus the light lines across them makes the whole circle look lighter. And in fact, that's the opposite direction as you get with this figure, where this one is darkened by the surrounding, and then over here it's actually lightened by its sort of assimilation here. And I bring this up because this ends up looking fairly similar to some recent experiments where we're looking at transparency. Because I think if you look at this also, you could think of this as layering, perhaps, right? These white stripes are in front of what you might interpret as a solid circle behind it. And maybe there's some transparency to be interpreted there as well. Here's what something similar looks like in AR. So to try to explain this, these cubes are 3D rendered cubes at different orientations on an AR screen. And in the background is this striped pattern. So the stripes come through the AR. And what's interesting about that is that they seem to come through maybe less distinctly where the cube is bright, but more distinctly where the cube is dark, right? So you see here the kind of medium versus this where it's really bright or really dark. And the bright and dark of the cube makes sense because that's from the illumination simulated as a 3D object. But the amount of sort of perceived transparency really correlates with brightness. And that means where the cube is brighter, it appears more opaque, and where the cube is darker, it appears more transparent. And that's really kind of a problem if you're making AR, because you probably would like the freedom to put a dark object or a shaded object in AR, but when you put something dark in AR, it actually becomes transparent, and that's kind of a drag. So we did some experiments to really study this. Perhaps you already know that steps of equal luminance do not appear consistent perceptually, right? These steps appear small and then they get bigger and bigger as you go down in luminance. So we already know, regardless of AR, that brightness is not the same as luminance. So these steps should be equal in brightness in the setup that we made in the lab. And we also made measured steps of equal transparency. And so each of these steps is uniformly different in transparency from one to the next. And what you see here, hopefully, is that the brightness scale and the transparency scale are pretty much the same, right? Both of them are much different from the luminance scale. And this correlation is quite strong between brightness and transparency, or brightness and opacity, if you think of it that way. So a couple other things to mention before I wrap up. The last piece is kind of coming at it from the other end. So far I've been talking about all the ways we try to figure out how things appear in AR. Another way to look at it, of course, is how do you make an AR system better, right? And you sort of say, well, I've got this transparency in my system, which isn't ideal, but it's there. And so how do you make the best of it? And so one way to think about that is to think about image processing manipulations you might do to make the images look better. So let me explain this briefly. There's 2 pictures here from a setup where the background is this sort of floor and wall and color target. That's really there illuminated. And then the AR foreground is this fruit. It's a photograph of fruit in this case instead of computer graphics. But you can clearly see that it's distorted, right? Especially the bottom edge of this pear where it's in shadow and therefore it's darker. The background comes through it pretty clearly, right? You get this red coming through there. This apple with a brighter gray background is even worse, right? You can't even really see the bottom half of this apple because its shadow means it's also transparent. So you might think about, well, how do you make this pear look better, right? You could make the whole thing brighter and then it overcomes the background, becomes more opaque, probably. Or you could conceivably bring up the black level, right? If black becomes transparent, well, just don't go so black, right? Make it sort of gray instead. And you might think, well, either of these pairs is sort of distorted from the pair that you wanted, but maybe it's better than this transparency and that distortion. So there's sort of a, trade-off balance to be made here where you might change your image processing to make the best of the system. And we've done some experiments to try to figure out what the optimum of that is. And we're doing a new experiment now with faces instead of pairs, because I think that's probably more relevant to most people's use cases for AR displays. So one maybe final thing to mention here, to bring something from way back in history, I used to be a photographer. I used to shoot sports when I was in high school for the local newspaper. So here's a photograph that I took in, I don't know, 1990 or so. And I put it here to just show you how poor the image quality is and was in newspapers, right? This is a scan of a print where white is, this sort of pale gray, and black is this slightly darker gray, right? The dynamic range of the newspaper is like, 7 to 1 in luminance units, compared to modern displays and TVs, which are like 1,000 to 1, right? And you get much more contrast. And yet, we have no trouble at all interpreting this photo, right? It's a decent, crisp image. Clearly, this guy's about to steal the ball. It looks cool. We have no trouble interpreting image content, even though the whole container, like the media that you're showing it with, is constrained. And so I have a feeling that AR kind of behaves the same. And over the course of using the system through these experiments, through kind of getting used to it, I think people are able to interpret this, right? You probably have no trouble seeing that this is an apple, right? It's clearly image quality-wise fairly distorted, but clearly an apple. And so categorically, it's no trouble to realize that this is red and that it is an apple. But there's this sort of visual discounting that leads you to that conclusion. So I think this isn't a conclusion, but just sort of something food for thought to think about, like how we get used to the limitations of a given medium and might, kind of give the benefit of the doubt to systems that we get familiar with. So as I get back to this overall goal of making a color appearance model for AR, I put a little bit more detail on the left side here, right? The stimulus that we're interested in AR, I think we realize more clearly now, is this blend of foreground and background, right? The AR and the real world. The surround effect is not just the pixels around it, it's also the context, the understanding of what's happening in the scene, and a measure of somehow how much discounting is happening. And then the adaptation part that we're interested in here, you have this mixed situation where as you look through this, you see the real world behind, which has illumination that you would be adapted to normally. But then you also have this extra stuff. So your chromatic adaptation and your lightness adaptation are affected somehow by both. And we're starting new experiments now to really try to piece that out and figure out what the state of adaptation is. So the goal is to improve this color appearance model to give us these values that describe what's happening. Oh, and by the way, I added a characteristic here, transparency, which we don't normally think of. Well, in some cases, yes, but usually a color appearance model is giving us brightness, colorfulness, and hue, but we're also interested in this transparency dimension as well. And so the result of all of this, right, is two things. One is sort of better understanding how our visual system processes these kind of stimuli, right, which is good knowledge scientifically and might lead to something else later. But also there's the sort of near-term practical implication of like, how do we use this knowledge to improve, the next AR display, both on the optics side, but also on the software and content side. How do you give advice to content makers based on this perceptual knowledge so that they can make their stimuli as visible or compelling or whatever else they're trying to do as possible. So since we haven't had too many comments, I'll leave you with one image that's a bit funny. The funniest thing I saw on Reddit recently, Schrodinger's cat, which is again kind of like Pepper's ghost, bit of a transparency in Windows trick. Hopefully you find that funny. And I thank you for listening, and I welcome any other questions that you might have.
Oh, thank you, Professor McMurden, for giving us a wonderful talk. We are very grateful to have learned AI application with color. So thank you also for everyone who attended. If you would like to continue follow Professor Mac's work, please follow him on LinkedIn or Twitter or the Master Color Lab website. The website link I already put in the chat, and questions are all welcome. So.
And now I can see the chat. So if anybody's chatting a question in there, feel free. Whoa, all this social media. Cool. It's a very well advertised talk. So I was pleased to see that on Twitter and stuff. So it's good. Does anyone had any experience with AR that's related? Anybody have any insights for me or found themselves wondering about transparency?
Mike, maybe I'll go with a quick question. First of all, I'll tell you how much I appreciate the talk, and it's really fascinating. I guess visual perception is always cool. Color visual perception is interesting. Now you bring in AR with transparency, foreground, background. It's amazing. But of course, I'm always looking at it from an image processing perspective, given my research interests, and you kind of got to it at the end. So one aspect is to understand and study visual perception in this context, and then how to improve AR systems based on this knowledge. And you kind of got to it at the end where there's this idea of adapting essentially how you project to augmented content based on what is in the background. And I guess one other challenge there will come in, even if we figure that out, I guess the issue is that you have to do that quickly after an object is actually displayed in the real environment. So you have to figure out what's in the background and then act quickly. And especially in a dynamic environment, that might even be more challenging as things change. Do you have any thoughts on, well, how practical it would be to actually do this in a typical AR headset?
Yeah, those are good questions. I guess I have several maybe kind of related thoughts. There are some, well, relatively early in this field is from maybe early 2000s kind of, but papers on like correcting for background. So you could imagine even with a visual optical see-through system, there's still a forward-looking camera that can see what's happening in the scene. And if you know you're overlaying an object on a background with a given pattern on it, that camera can see the pattern and relate that to pixel by pixel what the overlay is going to be, and then compensate, right? Each pixel accounting for basically subtracting out the background color that would be coming through it. So some early work on that was just trying to do a complete physical correction for everything, which ends up limited, of course, by the dynamic range. You can't subtract out light to some extent, right? But I think our insights since then are that you don't have to do 100% physical correction, right? Because you do this visual discounting, you maybe going a part-way correction would be enough. So that's one thing to think about. Exactly how far you need to go, I'm not sure yet, and it does seem to depend on things, which is a little unfortunate. The other maybe sort of positive thing is that, as I mentioned, the sort of media adaptation idea, let me just turn this off so I can see better. As people get used to the system, sort of they're able to ignore the background more, which is only positive for the users of these systems, right? There may be sort of a getting used to it period where after that everything is better, right? The other related thing, I suppose, is with other sort of dynamic algorithms you're already used to in your phone, for example, right? Like you take your phone outdoors and it gets brighter automatically. You bring it indoors and it dims automatically because they've finally built in sensors for those things. You could do the exact same thing in an AR system, especially for the chromatic adaptation I was talking about. It would make sense for, the basic hypothesis is that you probably want to follow the color of the ambient lighting to some extent in the system. But there's always going to be some temporal consideration to that. Your adaptation is not instant. Maybe you want to follow the adaptation. Maybe you want to lead the adaptation. I'm not sure. Maybe you're willing to tolerate a delay. And so I think those kind of time-based things are also connected to how you correct for a background. And you probably, if you tried to correct everything instantly, you're probably going to end up with lag, which is going to be distracting. But if you can smooth it out temporarily, that would be probably a better guess, but I don't think that's been proven yet. So hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have a quick question about kind of the modeling that you guys do. So is the current state kind of like pretty early on in terms of, so for example, you showed, I mean, I'm sure that was like a pretty simple experiment just for demonstration purposes, but basically you had the pair and then you were like, oh, if we just work on the black spots or the shadow area, we can increase the opaqueness or like make it more visible on the background. What, I guess, how far have you come so far with like a more complicated model where you are not just adjusting one parameter, but like, you know, all the other factors that you have. And then, because I imagine like to test all of this, it takes a long time. And then, so how far, because you bring in a lot of subjects and everything, but then I guess, how close are you to getting, I also don't know if the ultimate goal is to have no apparent transparency. So it kind of just shows like, regardless of the background, you can kind of just have it there. I guess, like, how far have you come with that?
Yeah, good question. And maybe to get to your last bit first, right? The idea of how much transparency do you want is a good question, because there's also, for different use cases, you might want your AR thing to look real, like a reflective object, like in the real world. But in a lot of applications, you really don't. And there's some cases, like you imagine for a head-up display in driving, where you really don't want to confuse the driver. You want to make it very clear what's real and what's not real, because you're it's an important situation, right? So that's one thing to say up front. But in terms of how far we have come, I said that in our first experiments, we were really like, boom, trying to adjust colors in all 3 dimensions, which is possible, but slow and noisy. And so we kind of distilled it down to just look at luminance first, and then kind of luminance and chroma for a given hue. And so kind of the number of dimensions that you work with is a limiting, or we've chosen to limit that. And so for what you're asking about, like the pair example there, the number of variations, right, it multiplies. And as you correctly said, we do need a lot of observers to look at it and look at it multiple times, and you're right, to create enough data to do statistics with. So, you know, number of foreground objects times number of background objects times number of dimensions that you give somebody to control, times the number of repeats times the number of observers. You can imagine this gets huge pretty quickly. And so we have to prioritize. And so to quickly answer you, I think the fruit experiment basically just had 2 simple parameters, kind of the curve shape, the gamma brightness of the thing, and the black level, which was just simply bringing that up. And again, for all pixels, right? We weren't trying to correct the pixels on the floor compared to the pixels above the floor differently, which is, you know, related to the previous question. That's also possible, but again, another bunch of variables to mess with. Current experiment, especially because it's dealing with faces, is looking at all 3 dimensions essentially, right? Kind of brightness, but also the hue and chroma of face pixels, because people are super sensitive to face colors in general, and there's so we want to make sure we adjust all of those. So, you know, it's hard to get everything, and we're kind of prioritizing and working through it as we can.
Yeah, it seems a bit overwhelming, but
you gotta just keep moving, right? Start somewhere and progress.
I was wondering if you could discuss for a minute the fact that the display itself is 3-channel 8-bit. That you essentially 0 to 255 dynamic range in red, green, and blue. So all of your arithmetic in the final stage is transformed into a very limited dynamic range, which is then superimposed on essentially a very wide dynamic range in the real world.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a major constraint in all of this, because things could easily go to an extreme and then you get no information. You essentially go to the equivalent of white or black in any of the channels. It's
Yeah.
much easier if you have a complete camera input versus your secondary channel, which you want to blend.
Mhm. Yep, I definitely agree. There's sort of limitations in terms of dynamic range. The trichromatic nature of the display or whatever, just because it aligns well with our visual system, doesn't end up being a limitation in terms of range of colors available. But definitely for dynamic range, it does. I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of push towards high dynamic range displays for TVs and for projectors and other things nowadays. Perhaps you'll start seeing that in VR displays, but that would be pointless in an AR display, for example, right? Because the black, you can't distinguish black levels anyway, right? So you don't need to like push the dynamic range deeper into the black for those. One thing maybe related to what you're asking, AR displays, they have something like a shaded sunglass kind of view of the real world behind, right? The newer generations, I just heard that the company Xiaomi, who just announced a new AR system, and also the later version of the Magic Leap display from Magic Leap, have adjustable kind of tint to the view of the outside world, right? So one thing that I'm sort of balancing the mixture between foreground and background with these sort of perceptual weightings, but these systems offer an additional like physical weighting. So you can like attenuate the background more and globally, right? So one nice solution would be, of course, if you could sort of pixel by pixel attenuate the background and make an occlusion layer, but that doesn't exist optically in a practical sense right now. But globally dimming the whole outside world will make the transparent display more visible, look more opaque in the foreground. So that's another way to think about the dynamic range. You can sort of like change the relative dynamic range of the real world versus the augmented piece that you're adding to it. I haven't had an experience with those systems, but I've heard that they're out there now. So I'm curious to see them.
Our experience has been in essentially laparoscopic surgery context, where you have essentially a color image of a surgical field inside the patient, and then a second channel of a fluorescent, near infrared fluorescent signal, where you want to see where the dye is, basically, which is invisible under normal conditions. And the trick is to maintain the anatomical detail, which is very much the foreground background issue. Okay. Because if you just overlay it, you just got this green blob, and you can't see the tissue. So you have to do a mixing thing. So you certainly made me think.
Okay, that's good. That's,
how I'm detecting the edge of the object of interest when I adjust the parameters about which you're speaking. So it makes me think it's so much easier if you just have the camera on the front of the faceplate, versus having to deal with the complexity of a real transparent display. Very difficult.
Yeah, there are definitely some real advantages to having the camera there, but I'd rather see the real world directly rather than moderated by a camera, I guess. So,
it makes the context of trying to do this in an open surgery context very difficult.
Yep. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about your application, right? Because there is no real world direct view in that situation, I suppose. And you always have probably have very strong kind of specular reflections also getting in the way of what you can see. So, yeah.
Yes, happy to chat with you about it sometime.
Cool, thanks. Anyone else want to admit to have used AR for anything? Have any comments or questions?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Murdoch. Yeah, so thanks everyone who attended our meeting and come here to learn the color in AR application. Please also check out the rest of the Voice of XR Space series. Our next speaker is Professor Ram Handans, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Orthopedics and the Center of Musculoskeletal Research at the University of Rochester. Professor Ram will discuss his work to develop the world-class motion labs that navigate XR technologies to clinical service and research and development. So the link is also in the chat. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.